I want to preface this video by saying that I have loved the Legend of Zelda series for most of my life, and will probably always continue to do so. I'm about to say a lot of things about the newest installment, Tears of the Kingdom. Many positives, but also many negatives. But all of it comes from me caring about the series a lot and wanting to see it be the absolute best that it can be. I did genuinely really enjoy Tears of the Kingdom, and it's a strong contender for my favorite game of the year up to this point. I think it's easily better than its immediate predecessor Breath of the Wild, and generally a decent step towards refining this relatively new open-world style of Zelda. But with all that being said, I can't help but scratch my head a bit when I see people parade this new game as the best in the series. While the game does have some truly fantastic high points, it also has some disappointing lows. While it did improve on Breath of the Wild in many ways, it left some of its most jarring issues practically untouched. So now that it's been about a month since I finished the game, with plenty of time to sit on my feelings for it, I want to talk about this game through a critical lens. I won't deny the game the praise that it deserves, but I also want to draw attention to some of its weaker aspects. Not so that I can be different and trash on it, but just to show why I feel we still have a long way to go before these open-world Zelda games can start living up to all of the hype they receive. I'm critical of Tears of the Kingdom not because I dislike it, but because I actually really love it. I want to reiterate before I begin that underneath it all, Tears of the Kingdom is a great game. It's just not a perfect one, and it's not really that close either. I feel like an essential understanding that's necessary going into my criticisms of this new installment is that Breath of the Wild was already a fairly divisive game within the greater Zelda community. Most fans will still generally agree that the game is good, great even, but older fans like myself quickly pointed out the lackluster story and near complete omission of standard dungeons, especially strange as both of these aspects had really started to become strong points of Zelda leading up to Breath of the Wild. Yet this new game shook everything up, replacing the epic and grandiose fantasy adventure of previous titles with a more quiet and understated journey. While the broader public adored it for its awe-inspiring sense of freedom and adventure, many Zelda fans bemoaned the lack of traditional series elements. Breath of the Wild quickly became the best-selling game in the series, which definitely didn't help things. It wasn't long before it felt like Nintendo was trying to make Breath of the Wild the new definitive game in the series. Whether that was through updating Link's design in Smash Bros., giving it dedicated spin-offs that didn't so much as acknowledge any other game in the series, or even by announcing a direct sequel, something exceedingly uncommon for the Zelda series. At a certain point, it became obvious that Breath of the Wild is to Zelda now what Ocarina of Time was to Zelda for the longest time. All eyes were on the sequel from day one, with an announcement trailer that was vague and mysterious in the best way possible. The game immediately drew comparisons to Majora's Mask, and those comparisons were only fueled by the producer claiming it would be the darkest game in the series. After that was one of the strangest build-ups to release I can remember for a video game. For years, we got no updates on the game whatsoever, and whenever we did get an occasional teaser, it was so brief that we pretty much got no new information out of it. None of these teasers looked anything like that initial one. We knew that it would reuse the same map as Breath of the Wild, but saw nothing that would set this game apart from that one. As the years came and went, the question, what have they been doing this whole time, just became more and more relevant. And it wasn't helped by the fact that Nintendo held back the real title of the game for a very long time, because it was supposedly a spoiler, a claim that nobody believed for a second. Hopes were high, but anxiety was even higher, both for classic fans of the series and people who had only just started to love it because of Breath of the Wild. For the newer fans, there were concerns that the reused map would make the game feel stale on arrival after players had already spent so much time exploring it in the last game. Breath of the Wild was a game that was driven almost entirely on exploration, so many wondered what the point would be to just exploring all of that again. For older fans, the biggest concern was that the elements of Zelda that they loved from previous titles would not be present here either, and that they would once again be in for a Zelda game with poor replacements for dungeons and a mediocre attempt at a story. As the months got closer and closer with the trailers still showing next to nothing, there was so much of the game that we hadn't seen, and plenty of people started justifiably worrying that the game would essentially be like a glorified DLC. Then Nintendo casually dropped one of the best trailers ever made for a video game. After this final trailer, we had finally seen clear and obvious differences to set itself apart from the original, as well as new hooks into what seemed to be a very unique and original story. Within those 3 minutes and 54 seconds, I immediately went from cautious and skeptical to literally counting down the days to release. I could not wait to get my hands on this game. And then, as one final sting for this weird-ass build-up to launch, the producer of the game nonchalantly confirmed that traditional dungeons would be returning after their absence in Breath of the Wild. I was in. So just to recap up to this point, my biggest expectation for Tears of the Kingdom was that it would retain what made Breath of the Wild's open world so magical while also integrating more of the elements that made the older games so great, specifically the story and dungeons. It could have been the perfect middle ground, combining strong aspects of multiple different points in the series to create something that was amazing in a new way. Now the game is here, and I've had plenty of time to sit on it. So, how well did it hold up to my expectations? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is the unique position that Tears of the Kingdom lies in as a direct sequel to the previous Zelda game. To those less familiar with the series, this may not seem like that big a deal at all, but the thing with Zelda is that sequels are extraordinarily rare, and when they do happen, they typically go a long way to have a very unique identity from the game that it's following. The best example of this is Majora's Mask, which, despite directly following Ocarina of Time and even reusing countless assets, ended up a radical departure from its predecessor, boasting both a darker tone and fundamentally different gameplay loop that revolved around a repeating 3-day cycle. Given that Breath of the Wild has seemingly come to replace Ocarina of Time as the ultimate Zelda game in Nintendo's eyes, many assumed that this sequel would change things to a similar degree. However, as the final game has proved, this was definitely not the case and likely never the intention. Tears of the Kingdom is extremely similar to Breath of the Wild in practically every way. The gameplay loop and mechanics at play are nearly identical, and as I mentioned before, the map is largely recycled from the last game. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. Breath of the Wild was already a great game with a great formula. What it really needed was a further refinement more than anything. And many of the elements absent from Breath of the Wild, such as more involved story or dungeons, were never really incompatible with that format. So this shouldn't have been a total deal breaker to anyone, aside from the very small minority of people that overtly hated the last game. However, Tears of the Kingdom once again proves itself to be a complete oddity by taking the chance at refinement and addressing almost none of the issues people took with Breath of the Wild. It may sound like I'm exaggerating by saying that, but I'm really not. Almost every single issue I took with the last game is still a problem for me here. Rain is still an obnoxious roadblock to progress with no good way around it, enemy variety is still laughably low, and weapon durability is abysmal. It feels like there were attempts to fix all of these, but those attempts were not effective at all. For example, there are elixirs and gear to help you bypass the negative effects of rain, but the gear requires exploring almost the entire surface map, and the base level of the elixir is nowhere near effective enough to be useful. There are a few more enemies, but they're almost entirely relegated to new areas such as caves. And it seems like weapon durability was assumed to be fixed by the new fuse mechanic, which is something I'll get into much more later on, but in reality, even weapons strengthened by fusion will break extremely quickly. I think having weapon durability in these games is a good idea, but it's just way too overbearing as it is, and it hurts the game more than it adds to it. The story is especially disappointing because this is the one part of the game that I thought for sure was a guaranteed success based on that final trailer. To explain my issues with the story of Tears of the Kingdom, I should give some context as to why Breath of the Wild's never really worked for me, or many others. That was a game that had you waking up as an amnesiac 100 years after a tragedy that you knew next to nothing about, and it was up to you to slowly piece together what happened through flashbacks, which could be attained in any order. Watching the story play out so far removed from your own actions led to a story with little to no emotional stakes, and the extremely likely possibility of seeing the story completely out of order certainly never helped things. It's hard to get invested in what's happening on screen when it's all water under the bridge to the world that you're actively exploring. I was so confident that Tears of the Kingdom would fix my issue with the last game's story, because now we're firmly set in the present day so the story could be playing out in real time and events could proceed with an actual structure and real stakes. But in the most baffling move in this entire weird-ass game, Nintendo have gone out of their way to reuse what is possibly the worst story structure I have ever seen. Minor spoilers for the first few hours if you care about that kind of thing. But in the opening of the game, Zelda ends up getting sent back thousands of years to an ancient version of Hyrule. So instead of seeking out Link's memories, this time around you're searching for Dragon's Tears to piece together what happened with Zelda in ancient Hyrule. I can't even begin to describe the sheer disappointment that I felt when I found that very first Dragon's Tear. After the opening of the game did such a great job hooking me with real-time events and making me want to see what happened next, I never would have imagined that they would have specifically written the game around reusing the memory structure. I tried to stay invested in the story of the game after that, but I can remember the exact moment I checked out for good. It was my second Dragon's Tear, and because you can once again get these things in any order, I accidentally found one of the latest ones just a few hours into the game. And I was sitting there watching this climactic event play out with absolutely no build-up, utilizing characters I'd never seen and plot devices that had never even been mentioned. In that moment, I felt so disconnected from everything that I was seeing. I consciously realized that there was no way I was ever going to be able to follow this story in a way that felt satisfying. I should also add that even if you were to get all of the Dragon's Tears in order, you would still have to go ridiculously far out of your way to obtain all of the memories in the correct order, because there are multiple that are acquired through main story missions, many of which you won't have access to until late in the game. So because of the memory structure, it is nearly impossible to experience the story unfolding in a satisfying way. It just sucks because this issue could have been avoided so easily, but it feels like they went out of their way to make the game worse in this regard. The most common rebuttal I've heard towards complaints of the story in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is that this story structure allows the game to be as open-ended as it is without running into ludonarrative dissonance. I've even heard people call these games incompatible with a more direct method of storytelling. After all, it wouldn't make much sense for there to be urgent sequences with high stakes if at any point you could completely ignore it and come back later. This critique made sense for Breath of the Wild, because with Link waking up with no memories in that game, it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that he might not care all that much about the state of the kingdom, and have no motivation to go after it. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't really get to fall back on that excuse, and honestly, it directly plays into it. The game opens with a high-stakes encounter, and the opening hours play out with the singular goal being to find Zelda. Yet the moment you touch the surface of Hyrule, you're free to completely ignore all of that. And further into the late game, it actually does start to follow a more linear structure, and it's significantly more engaging than anything that came before. So why couldn't they just have the whole thing work like this? Tears of the Kingdom had the opportunity to easily address one of Breath of the Wild's greatest failings. However, this opportunity was skipped with seemingly no reason. The memory structure no longer holds any narrative benefit, the entire setup feels specifically written around being as disengaging as possible, and on top of that, the story itself once again offers nothing in terms of endearing characters, interesting plot points, or exciting moments until its very final hours. It's unabashedly mediocre for the vast majority of its runtime, and one of the most wholeheartedly disappointing video game stories I have ever seen. I didn't want something on the level of, I don't know, The Last of Us or any sprawling JRPG. I just wanted something that would make me care, and Tears of the Kingdom completely failed me in that aspect. I will admit that some of my distaste for the story is down to completely personal preference. My taste in games tends to skew towards those that are more linear. I can appreciate more open-ended design, but it's not necessarily the type of game that speaks to me personally. I've come to realize that for many, if not most players at this point, the exact opposite is true. And for that type of player, Tears of the Kingdom will absolutely be one of the most magical gaming experiences possible. In terms of game design, this game is quite literally as open as you could possibly get, and I'd even go as far as to say that this is the most open-ended game I've ever played that isn't a full-on sandbox like Minecraft. On one hand, it builds off the already expansive open world from Breath of the Wild, but it opens it up even further with dozens of sky islands as well as another sprawling underground layer called the Depths. Neither of these are anywhere near as dense or diverse as the surface, but I feel like they still have their own worth through the unique navigational challenges that they offer. The Sky Islands will have you constantly experimenting with how to navigate from island to island, sometimes across massive distances that seem all but impossible to successfully cross. The Sky Islands are essentially one biome scattered across Hyrule skies, as every island looks and functions mostly the same. However, because the actual islands take up such a relatively small percentage of the map, and because the distance between these islands provides its own challenge not present anywhere on the surface, I find myself really fond of the sky, and I think it was a great worthwhile addition. I love the sense of scale they provide as well. Looking down and seeing the entirety of Hyrule below you never gets old. The one thing that I will knock the Sky Islands for is that there is a lot of repeated content up here. You'll be doing the same kinds of challenges over and over, and executing these rarely requires any kind of difference in approach. Some of them are even shaped exactly the same. But that being said, it's not too egregious, and I still found exploring the sky to be pretty fun overall. Much of the game's marketing was focused on these sky islands, but on the other side of the surface was something carefully hidden up until the game's release. That being the Depths. Much like the sky, this is essentially one biome stretched out across all of Hyrule. However, instead of this biome being found in multiple small sections, the depths legitimately span the entire map. I'm mixed on these. On one hand, the first time I entered the depths was incredible. The entire thing is pitch black, which made every single step ahead of me a mystery. Above the surface, I would usually base my sight on whatever I saw out in the distance that looked interesting, but now that sight was robbed of me, and it made things really tense. Adding to that tension was the fact that my maximum health was constantly at danger of being drained whenever I was attacked. And since I was only around 6 or so hearts when I came down here the first time, I was constantly on edge. However, that tension only lasted so long, and I left the depths for the first time completely empty-handed, not sure what the point of being down there was at all. I would later learn that the biggest benefit to braving the depths is being able to obtain Zonite and crystallized charges to upgrade your Zonite battery. That's a solid enough reward, but I can't help but feel like the depths are so disconnected from the rest of the game. And the only reasons I ended up going down there after my initial exploration were either because a quest had pointed me down there, or at the very end of my time with the game, because I actively went out of my way to explore it all just for the sake of it. I should note that the one legitimate attempt at connecting the depths with the other layers of the map comes through these old bottles, which will show you a spot in the depths to look out for. You're not sure what it means at first, but you'll quickly learn that these usually consist of armor pieces that reference past Zelda games. As a longtime fan of the series, I always enjoyed discovering these, and the whole map charting system felt very reminiscent of Wind Waker in a good way. However, I still didn't find this a sufficient enough connection between layers of the map. Let me elaborate by explaining why I find that the sky and surface are perfectly connected. Something that happened to me pretty frequently throughout my playthrough was that I would be exploring the surface, and then as a part of my surface exploration, I would seek out towers to fill out my map. These towers would then launch me into the sky, and I would be immediately tempted with multiple islands. And I knew these would be worthwhile in the sense of having a shrine, so that I could get a reward like a Blessing of Light, which I could always use to extend my stamina or health. And as I already mentioned, you can always see the surface layer from up in the sky, which gives you a fantastic lookout for interesting areas or other shrines. The depths do have a direct link to the surface through these chasms, but there's typically no reason to go into these. The sky towers worked because they would also fill out your map, but the only feature of the chasms is to let you access the depths, so there's never any incentive. And once you are in the depths, there's practically no way to access or even view the land above without teleporting out. There's no shrines in the depths, so there's nothing to look out for in terms of meaningful rewards. And like I mentioned earlier, you can upgrade your battery through Zonite, but that's not found through doing anything specific, so there's really no objectives during normal exploration. I was okay with the sky being almost entirely the same biome because of how scattered the islands were, but since the depths are so sprawling, it really doesn't take long for them to become stale and monotonous. The darkness that I initially found thrilling soon became tedious, and the threat of less maximum hearts began to mean nothing as I had as many as 35. I think the light routes down here are a very nice way to give you a short-term destination, but you don't really get much out of it other than that. The depths are certainly impressive in scale, and I won't act like I didn't have any fun with some of it, but overall I just didn't find them very compelling. I've seen multiple reviews of this game that mentioned how little of the depths they had actually explored, and this was usually done to emphasize the size of this layer of the map. But when you take a step back and look at everything that the depths actually offer, it's very easy to see why most people end up leaving the majority of it untouched. I definitely wouldn't call it worthless, but I think it needed to be scaled down significantly. So while Tears of the Kingdom's open-endedness was greatly expanded through its sheer world size, that hardly compares to how the game has taken Breath of the Wild's mechanical foundation and cracked it open to become something that is truly unrivaled within the industry. Much of the game functions pretty much the same as the last one, but the big key difference here is Link's abilities. The runes from Breath of the Wild are no more, but it's hard to miss them too much because their replacements are so much better and more fun than the runes ever were. The first new ability you get is Ultra Hand. It's extremely simple to describe, it just lets you attach pretty much any objects you can find to each other. And that really is all there is to it, but it becomes so obvious so quickly that it cracks the game open to an almost inconceivable level. It's really difficult to properly illustrate the effect this has on moment-to-moment gameplay, but you will quickly find applications for it in overworld traversal, puzzle solving, and even combat. What starts as connecting two logs quickly turns into building a full bridge, or a raft, or even just completely functioning vehicles. It gets really crazy, and looking online you can find countless clips of people doing just the most absurd things. The next ability is Fuse, which allows you to fuse practically any object in the game to your weapons and shields. You can approach this from a fairly basic standpoint of only using this to make your weapons and shields more effective with monster parts, or you can dig a little deeper and find some of the more unique applications. For example, depending on what you fuse to a sword, it could end up functionally turning into either an axe or a hammer, which have totally different uses throughout the environment. And this feature is only expanded further through the new Zonai devices you can find, which can not only make your variety of weapons even wilder than before with devices such as fans or flamethrowers, but you can also make your shields extremely useful tools. You can attach a minecart for easy transportation, or a rocket for easy height, or a spring to bounce off of, or even an explosive barrel so an enemy immediately regrets throwing an attack your way. And then on top of all of that, you can fuse any item in your inventory to an arrow and see all the varying effects there. I don't even want to know how insanely long it took to code all of this, but it went into a mechanic that had me constantly experimenting throughout my entire playthrough. Ascend doesn't deal as much with the objects that you interact with, but rather the environment that you explore. It's fairly self-explanatory in the fact that it lets you ascend through practically any flat ceiling in the entire game, as long as it's in range. It's quite a simple move, but it really does crack open the game so much, just like every other ability in the game. Whether it's a convenient exit from a cave or a way to explore a dungeon outside of the intended order, Ascend goes a very long way to making traversal as open as possible. The last new ability to Tears of the Kingdom is Recall, which allows you to reverse the motion of almost any object. While not as hugely open-ended as the rest of the abilities, it still proves itself to be an undeniably useful tool to your arsenal, making for extremely fun and interesting problem solving while also serving as essentially an undo button for when you inevitably lose control of your Ultra Hand creations. It may seem like there aren't a ton of applications for this one, but playing the game quickly proves that to not be the case. By far the most impressive part of these abilities, though, is the way that they all connect with each other. You could use Ascend to get to the top of an Ultra Hand creation to reach a destination in a whole new way, or toss a fused weapon so that the unique item is used on impact before recalling it back to your hand. I could go on and on, but there's so many possibilities here, more than I could ever talk about or even imagine. And that is the true beauty of Tears of the Kingdom. The game has given you its blessing to take on any challenge in any way that you could possibly imagine. Whether that's the shrines, which now have multiple different solutions, or figuring out different ways to overcome navigational challenges, or even finding unique ways to obliterate enemies in combat. There really is no set way to do anything in this game. So with all four of these abilities combined, on top of the insanely expansive open world, yeah, Tears of the Kingdom is a remarkably open-ended game from moment to moment. Breath of the Wild already had a huge breadth of activities and destinations that you could choose from at any given moment, and not only is that expanded even further here, but now you can choose to go about any of these activities in countless different ways. And that's by far the biggest selling point of Tears of the Kingdom for a lot of people. It's the best and most impressive aspect of the game without a doubt, and I'm certain that it's the main reason it's been heralded with perfect review scores across the board. I find Tears of the Kingdom's approach extremely impressive, specifically in regard to its mechanics. But to be honest, I found myself wishing that the game had a bit more structure to it and didn't let me go so far off the rails. I've already talked about how finding one of the dragon tears early made me tap out of the narrative, but I had another example which made the pacing of the whole adventure feel incredibly awkward. It's tough to talk about this without spoilers, so I'll be very vague, but if you finished the game, you should know what I'm talking about. About halfway through my time with the game, I just happened to stumble upon a certain island in the sky during my exploration, and what I never could have predicted was that this island contained an item which sent me spiraling down a hugely important late-game quest. On one hand, the sense of mystery and adventure during this section was absolutely off the charts in a way that it never could have been had I played the game in its intended order. On the other hand, it feels like I spoiled myself on a really cool surprise that I would have found much more exciting had I seen it towards the climax of the game. When I finally did reach the climax, it felt awkward and short-lived. What should have been an intriguing mystery to unravel was instead quickly swept under the rug. The characters even acknowledged that I had already completed this section of the game, and while that was a charming nod, I couldn't help but feel like I had played the game the wrong way, just because I was curious about something, and now I'll never get to know what it's like to see that section of the game play out as intended. However, while that experience left me with a bitter taste in my mouth, I can easily see another player having the same experience and seeing it as a massive highlight of their playthrough. It's not necessarily a bad thing for every player, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I do not like this kind of thing at all. I wish I could just follow the events of the game in a way that makes sense without fear of exploring too much and seeing something that I'm not supposed to yet. The vast open world does not necessarily have to come at the cost of any kind of structure, yet for the vast majority of the game's main questline, that's exactly what happens. You're essentially thrown out into the world and told to do whatever you want, just like the last game, but unlike last time, there are plenty of things here that you may not want to experience just yet, and there's no good way to know to avoid them. To best demonstrate why structure and freedom are not mutually exclusive, we don't have to stray far at all. A Link Between Worlds was the last mainline Zelda game before Breath of the Wild, and it did an excellent job at pairing the two ideas. The way that game works is that there's plenty of dungeons that you can take on in basically any order you like, and you can rent any item in the game from Ravio at any point. But there's also distinct points in the game that you cannot access without first reaching a certain point in the story. So there's multiple sections, but in each of these sections you can do whatever is available to you at any order. This allows that sense of player freedom while also ensuring that none of the narrative weight and pacing that comes with a more structured experience is lost. I understand that A Link Between Worlds is a significantly smaller scale game than Tears of the Kingdom, but I don't see why the same design philosophy couldn't have been applied. Another series that does something kinda similar is Metroid. Those games provide a very satisfying intended sequence of events that can be completely broken the more you understand how the game works. The structure present in those games is exactly why the freedom that's also present is so impressive and exciting. I just think Tears of the Kingdom runs with its open-endedness a bit too much, and it ends up creating an unsatisfying playthrough experience as a result. This open-ended design actually extends into the dungeons as well. Instead of a satisfying progression of puzzle ideas that become gradually more complex the deeper into the dungeon you go, these new dungeons put multiple terminals throughout a given area and simply task you with activating them in whatever way you can find. There's very few environment-specific mechanics, so it can feel somewhat like 4 or 5 shrines just crammed into one location. That's a more pessimistic way to look at it though, and I want to start this discussion by noting that even the weakest dungeons in this game are undeniably a massive improvement from the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild. Layouts are more interesting, and they're all visually varied in unique ways. The puzzles are generally really fun, once again owing to the fantastic new abilities that this installment offers, and working my way through them for the most part felt great. They're all topped off with boss fights that I found really distinct and enjoyable, and I never would have been able to confuse any of these dungeons for one another, which is something that I definitely could not have said for Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts. That being said, I unfortunately found about half of the dungeons here really underwhelming. The water and wind temples in this game don't do much for me at all, and I don't think it's a coincidence that these are the ones with the more open layouts. The fire and lightning temples, on the other hand, I enjoy much more. These have more of a linear layout that's akin to dungeons in classic titles, and finding your way from one terminal to the next is a bit of a fun challenge in and of itself. These dungeons retain the freedom of the rest of the game in the way that you approach them while still keeping enough of a structure so that players like me can find them fun and satisfactory. Even though I would still take some more traditional Zelda dungeons over these are not bad at all. I also wish there were way more of them. They all coincide with the end of story quests, but that doesn't leave many, and when comparing the scope of this game to other Zelda games, that low number is especially disappointing. They're also in the exact same areas as the Divine Beasts from the last game, leaving areas that could have been expanded further just the same as they were before. If you remember back to the beginning of this video, I mentioned that better dungeons were my biggest hope for Tears of the Kingdom alongside a better story. The dungeons were absolutely better, but I still found half of them really underwhelming, and even the ones that I did like still weren't quite there for me. They just needed to be a focus, but once again they feel like an afterthought. Just as one last miscellaneous note, everybody has mentioned this already, but yes, the performance of this game is completely unacceptable for a 2023 release. I want to say that I actually find it extremely impressive that this game runs on the Switch at all, given its massive scale, and being able to condense everything this game has to offer into only 18 gigabytes is extraordinarily impressive. It's just such a shame that it's locked on hardware that clearly cannot handle the ambitions of the developers. This has become an increasingly concerning issue for Nintendo games over the Switch's lifespan, but I have never felt the console screaming for help more than I did here. There were points where the frame rate dipped so low that my eyes were straining. It's terrible. Nintendo seriously needs to step up their game in the hardware department soon. I know I've been going pretty hard on the game, but I just want to reiterate that I really did mean what I said at the beginning of the video. I love Tears of the Kingdom. Through all of my issues, all of my nitpicks, and all of my crushed hopes, there was rarely a point when playing where I wasn't enjoying myself. I was amazed by the constant new discoveries I was making seemingly every minute. I loved the shrines and becoming intimately familiar with my new set of abilities that drew creativity out of me in a way that no game has before. My determination to see as much of this game as I could never wavered, and it ended up being by far my longest single playthrough of any video game, even managing to top giants like any of the Persona or Xenoblade games. And looking back on it all, I don't regret any of the time that I spent with this game. So no, Tears of the Kingdom is not the game that I wanted it to be. My issues with the last game went practically untouched and even made worse in some cases, and my desperate hope for more of a structured main questline went completely unsatisfied. I still feel like there's a long way to go before I am completely satisfied with these new open-world Zelda games, and if Nintendo keeps going down this direction, that may never happen. If I were to rank all the Zelda games, Tears of the Kingdom would definitely not be near the top. But it would be above Breath of the Wild, and I want to emphasize that for how highly I hold the Zelda series as a whole, being ranked anywhere near most of those games is a huge compliment for me that most games would never get. This video was never meant to be contrarian, just constructive. Tears of the Kingdom is a great game, but it's not a perfect one. I judge it so harshly because I want it to be the best that it possibly could be, and it's not there yet.